It's worth saying a word about that. I mean, the AUKUS program is the single biggest call, I would say, that I've seen in my lifetime in this industry. I mean, it's a huge, huge call.
The following is for information purposes only and should not be used as the basis of an investment decision. This is not investment advice. This episode is made possible by Progressive Equity Research, providing freely available, engaging investment research and opportunities to hear from a wide range of small and mid-cap UK-listed companies. For this episode, I'm joined by Tom Like, analyst at Singer Capital Markets, for a conversation with Nick Prest, the founder-chairman of defence services and technology company Cohort. Prior to founding Cohort, Nick worked in the Ministry of Defence before joining United Scientific Holdings, later renamed Alvis. A few years later, Nick became CEO. Alvis was eventually acquired by BAE, and with a number of former colleagues, Nick set up Cohort in 2006 with a market value of £26 million and the ambition to provide technical services to the defence industry in the UK and abroad. Today, 18 years later, Cohort is the parent company of 6 operating businesses, providing a wide range of services and products for British and international customers in defence, security and related markets, and has a market capitalisation of £335 million. In a fascinating discussion, Nick talks about the changing nature of the defence industry over his long career, why he decided to establish Cohort, how he has gone about making acquisitions and develop a decentralised operating model for the group, how the listed defence industry has changed, and how our rapidly changing geopolitics is likely to change the operating environment for Cohort in the coming years. With defence spending rising up the priority list for all Western countries, the outlook for Cohort and the rest of the defence industry hasn't looked this good for decades. As he says, the expansion of the Chinese Navy over the last 20 years is a source of considerable concern to other countries in the region, such as Australia, Indonesia, Thailand and the Philippines, all of which are Cohort customers. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war in Ukraine has radically changed perceptions about the need to further fund defence budgets. I began by asking Nick about his background and how and why he came to establish Cohort in 2006.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
I'm a non-engineer and a non-tech in an engineering and tech environment, which is quite an important point to make at the outset because I think it has influenced my career and the way that things have been done. I did history and economics at university. I was interested in a commercial career. I had lots of good offers on the milk round, as it was in those days. I did the civil service exam and passed it for the fast entry into the civil service. It was a prestigious thing to do. I had university friends who were cleverer than me who didn't pass the exam. I did 7 years in the MOD, and I was assigned to the MOD. That was the way it worked in the Home Civil Service. I didn't choose it. So I did 7 years, mixture of roles, some policy, some related to procurement and equipment. But I decided that a lifetime career in the civil service was not for me for a variety of reasons. I didn't like the lack of accountability was the principal point. I was able to leave because my last job in MOD was working in the Defence Sales Department, which was the government outfit that helped industry in promoting sales. It's a very political business, and obviously the military play a role in it. So I did that job in the Middle East for a couple of years, really at a very young age. And I was mid-20s, dealing with all sorts of strange characters in Iraq and Egypt and so on, and learning a lot. But I decided to leave, and I joined Alvis, which was run by a guy called Peter Levine, subsequently quite well known. Peter, he was boss of Canary Wharf out of bankruptcy, and he was Lord Mayor of London, chairman of Lloyd's and various things. But in those days, he had built up a small, very successful defence business, originally called United Scientific Holdings, which was the fastest growing public company in the UK between the early 70s and the early 80s. I joined Peter and learned a huge amount from him. He moved on after a couple of years and actually went to the MOD to run procurement. I stayed, ended up becoming CEO of Alvis in 1989 when I was 36, and it went from there. I came into it from that route and worked the sales, commercial, project management side. I did not come up the engineering route of the business. I was CEO when I was 36 in 1989 through to BAE buying the business at the end of 2004, so about 15 years. The 90s were not an easy period in the defense business. I mean, people forget this now, but the real value of defense procurement in the Western world dropped by 2/3, roughly speaking, between the end of the Cold War in 1990 and sort of 2000 and then the beginning of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So that was a huge change. There was a massive consolidation in the industry. And Alvis had two strings to its bow. It was an electro-optics company on the one hand, with a number of businesses, and then the armoured vehicle company, Alvis itself. And we were not number one in the UK in either of those areas. So it wasn't an easy path to navigate through a process of consolidation, because normally in that the smaller ones are brigaded into the bigger ones is how it works. And that's pretty much what happened. But by various means, we managed to find our way around that and acquired our bigger rivals in the UK, which were GKN and Vickers. And we bought a number of businesses overseas, particularly in Scandinavia, in South Africa, and enjoyed a considerable measure of success and eventually disposed of the electro-optics business to Thales. By the early 2000s, we were quite well placed as a business, but the core customer in the UK was in a difficult position. I mean, the Army has struggled with its procurement for the best part of 30 years, and they've had various programs to replace armoured vehicles for the best part of 30 years. Stop, start, fail, start again, pick the wrong people. I looked at this at the beginning of the 2000s, and one of MOD's ideas was, this is no longer about vehicles. This is about systems and system of systems. And a vehicle is not a vehicle. It's just a sort of component in a larger sort of Star Wars game. And therefore, you, Alvis, you don't have all the resources that we need to manage these programs. But if you were to team with, for example, British Aerospace, then that would be a very good combination for us. So we teamed with British Aerospace for a program called FRES, Future Rapid Effects System, in the early 2000s. Essentially, I mean, the MOD pushed BAE and Alvis together for that program. And then a couple of things happened. One was that we had another major program called MRAV, Multi-Role Armoured Vehicle, now called Boxer, which was joint with Germany particularly and Holland. And the MOD pulled out of that program in 2002 because of muddled thinking by the Army, and they were sort of bamboozled by the Air Force who wanted the money. So they pulled out of the program, and that was a setback to the business. And to some extent, I looked ahead at the scenery. I lost confidence, really, in the home market, essentially. We were quite well placed. We had a decent order book. I looked ahead, and I thought, well, we've done a lot of the hard yards, but actually the next 10 years in the UK looks potentially quite difficult. And General Dynamics had been very interested in us, and they made an approach. So we got into talks with General Dynamics. They made an offer. And then BAE had already acquired 29% of the business from GKN, who got 29% as a result of us buying their armoured vehicle business at the end of the 90s. And BAE used that as a platform to buy the business. So that's what happened. It didn't end very well. I mean, I think MOD, having sort of encouraged Alvis and BAE got to get together for programs, then didn't actually like the idea of BAE dominating the land systems space as well as naval and aircraft systems in the UK. So they went down a different track of picking American companies to do this work for them. So the upgrade of Warrior and then the Ajax program, both of which had enormous problems. I mean, Warrior upgrade ended up being cancelled, and Ajax has really struggled. So it's not been a happy story. But I think from the shareholders' point of view, that history proves that selling Alvis at that time was the right call for shareholders. I mean, I regretted it. I'd put 22 years of my life into the company, but it was the right thing to do. Afterwards, I mean, I was quite young, actually. I mean, I was 50 or 51, but I'd already been a CEO for about 15 years. And I took a decision I didn't want to to go back into another full-time executive role. But I wanted to remain involved with the sector. And I started turning over some ideas and worked with Andy Thomas, who is now the CEO of Cohort and had been the strategy director at Alvis. And Simon Walther also was the financial controller at Alvis. So this Cohort team are ex-Alvis people. And we've worked together for a very long time with all the advantages and disadvantages of that. There are many more advantages than disadvantages, but you have to bear in mind the disadvantages as well. And the idea of Cohort was that Kinetic was being privatized. They were the majority provider of research and independent technical advisory services to the MOD. We thought that once they were privatized, they wouldn't hang on to all that work because they were good in some areas and not so good in others. And at the same time, there were a number of smaller privately owned businesses operating in that space. And the concept of Cohort was to put them together, a bit more mass, a bit more profile, a bit more oomph behind them, and create a sort of independent defense technical services business that would be independent of Kinetic and a good option for the MOD and some other customers. So that's what we did by teaming up with a company called Systems Consultant Services, which was owned by a chap called Stanley Carter, who remains the largest shareholder in Cohort and is a strong supporter of the company and was on the board for many years. So we teamed up with Stanley and acquired Systems Consultant Services and simultaneously floated Cohort, and it went on from there.
How did you meet Stanley? What was the connection there?
It was one of those things where we hadn't actually dealt with SCS. But as we looked into them, I saw that they had a very good model. And we were approaching one or two others at the same time. But I rang up Stanley and said, here's my idea. We could get together and put your business together with a number of others. He was so surprised. He said, well, have you been bugging my office? Because it transpired that he had been thinking about exactly the same thing from his side. So we were a sort of easy sell to each other, really. We were complementary in that I brought the corporate background and so on, and Stanley brought the processes of a very successful business very well dug into the MOD in that area.
Can you just share with us how your vision back in those days compared with where the business is today, some 18 years later?
Well, it certainly evolved substantially. I would say the biggest evolution is that we started with the strategy and technical services, but two of the businesses that we acquired early on, MASS and SCA in particular, had elements of project execution and product inside them, as well as managed services and advisory work to the MOD. And as things went on, it emerged that our reading of the market was correct in one way, but not in others. I would say that a couple of things happened. Budgets actually on independent technical advice reduced rather than went up. All to feed other parts of the budget, particularly to spend on procurement. Also, they started putting more bits of work together into bigger packages and contracting outfits like Capita and so on, in order to save what they thought was administrative overhead on their side in dealing with a larger number of smaller companies and contracts. So that market didn't develop as promisingly as we expected. And at the same time, one or two of the product areas that we acquired looked good. And you could actually say, but back to one of your questions here, did you do Cohort because you wanted something different? Actually, the answer to that was rather yes. Alvis was a great business and I loved it, but it was a lumpy business. All defense is lumpy, but Alvis was dealing with large lumps relative to its size. And you were constantly flirting with sort of triumph or disaster. We managed reasonably well, but whatever it is, I personally I thought that the idea of a larger number of smaller contracts of lower profile down in the weeds of the MOD was a different sort of business model that had its challenges, but wouldn't have that particular stress involved in it. Of course, one gets drawn back to what one understands and perhaps what one's good at. It became apparent to me, not long really into Cohort's evolution, 3 or 4 years into the business, that the real expansion lay in the projects and product field rather than in technical services, although we do both. So the principal engine of expansion for the last 10 to 12 years, both organic and by acquisition, has been in products. And if you look back over the record, you will see that the proportion of product sales in our portfolio has grown considerably. And a fundamental reason for that is that these sort of technical services businesses, there is demand for it in the UK, one or two countries overseas, Australia, Canada. But in general, there's not a big export market for those kinds of services. Whereas for products, it's a worldwide market.
You mentioned obviously Mass and C were, I think, within a year and 3 months of floating at £27 million market cap, you then acquired C for £20 million. So it was a sizable transaction at the time, considering where the float was. You said it took you into products, which is obviously where the group has gone. Was there something in particular within the two businesses that you thought were important to own within the group, or did you just view it as a beachhead into new markets for both Mass and C?
They were good businesses, had been founded and were run by entrepreneurs who, for various reasons, wanted to move on. So they were agile and innovative, had good reputation with the customer, operating in some niche areas with a high degree of specialist capability. And those were the features that attracted us. In the case of SCA, principally in sonar and other underwater applications for the Navy. They also had a transport business and a space business. We sold the space business. We could come back to that. We still have the transport business. In the case of Mass, their two principal areas of specialism were electronic warfare operational support, where they had substantial contracts supporting the Royal Air Force at the Air Warfare Centre at Waddington in Lincolnshire, dealing with interpretation of signals and development of countermeasures and so on. And they also had that business in support of BAE in their export markets, originally for Tornado and then for Typhoon. Mass also had some significant work, which they still have, of very specialist software support for the MOD in some high security activities, which I couldn't really talk about anymore. So, high security IT and electronic warfare operational support were the Mass businesses. So those areas were all complementary to SCS. And there were entrepreneurs willing to sell, and we had good shareholder support at Cohort, and we acquired the businesses. SCA I pushed particularly hard for, and I really did the negotiations for the transaction, because if you have a certain degree of momentum, you've really got to take it while it's there. And once you've floated, you already have some overheads. We could come back to that. But running a smaller listed company now, public company, is an expensive business, unnecessarily expensive. It wasn't quite as expensive in 2007-8, but it already was expensive. To spread the overheads and actually have a professional management structure, you need a certain size of base. And I thought really that 3 businesses were the minimum size to make a viable group. So we pushed hard for it. In fact, some of my colleagues at the time have occasionally told me that they questioned the price we paid for SCA. It was a necessary thing to do, and it's worked out.
Yeah. What have been some of the sort of guiding principles, if I can call it that, or sort of success factors, or what have you looked for over the years when acquiring businesses? And we can come on to disposals later, but in terms of acquiring, what's the sort of checklist when you go down the route of identifying targets and ultimately acquiring them?
We do have a great deal of experience of the sector. We've seen what works, what doesn't work over a very long period of time. And I think that's very helpful. I think the second thing is that we've been patient, particularly with acquisitions. I mean, the easiest way, I'm touching a piece of wood here, the easiest way to mess up a lot of very hard work on organic growth is to foul up an acquisition, because you're paying many times a year's earnings for something. There's plenty of potential for those earnings not to be made for one reason or another. I mean, although, as I say, we pushed hard on Mass and SCA and it worked out, as a general principle, you can't, as a buyer, dictate when somebody's going to sell you their business and the price at which they're going to sell your business. You are a taker in that sense, both from the point of view of timing and price to an extent. So you have to be patient and take them when they're there. And an over-aggressive acquisition strategy usually ends in tears. We've been patient with respect to acquisitions. I think that's another factor. Compared with many businesses anyway, we have quite a devolved management structure. We place a great deal of responsibility on the businesses themselves for the key things they need to do to be successful, which are having good people, having things that customers want, delivering them well. Those things are the responsibility down in the guts of the subsidiaries that we own. And we have had to make management changes from time to time. They don't always work, but in general, I think the management model that we've used has enabled companies that come into the group to make a success of themselves. I mean, sometimes it takes time. I mean, SEA has been quite a long story. The product evolution has taken a long time, but it's not quick. When you're dealing with governmental defense customers who can take years over decisions and developing new, quite complicated products on not unlimited budgets and then getting them into the marketplace, it can be a process of some years. So the SEA evolution has been quite long, but it has been now very successful.
I wanted to come back to what you said earlier, which I thought was interesting. The city norm is a roll-up and the sort of 1 + 1 = 3 through synergies, and people get on the sort of M&A roll-up strategy. But Cohort's been a little bit different in terms of historically and capital allocation. You've also disposed of businesses.
We found that we couldn't make money in scientific space. The European Space Agency was the biggest customer. So they were doing very small volumes, often one-offs of very specialized equipment, dealing with a not easy customer. A very bureaucratic customer. He would make the MOD look positively flexible. They were good people. It's very strongly driven by engineering. It's based the engineering prized more than any financial results from it. In all businesses that require really good technical skills, that is a tension that you have to manage, because engineers want to do, quite understandably, what is really interesting engineering work. But not all really interesting engineering work is what the customer wants. And it's marrying up those things happily in the organization, which are important. We found in scientific space that was really skewed in the engineering direction. And we weren't making any money, and we were relatively small in it. So we sold it to a company that was a joint venture between Thales and Leonardo, actually, for whom it wouldn't have been a rounding error. They would have hardly even noticed they've got it there, I would think. I believe the team's gone on quite well with Thales, actually, so that's a good result too. But we did the right thing in disposing of it.
I think you touched on there in terms of engineers like talking to engineers, but in terms of Cohort has been successful, revenues have grown at a steady cadence, and the group's evolved. What's the industry recognition of Cohort, but also the collection of businesses today? You've had some very big wins in naval, not just the UK, but abroad, whether it's Italy or New Zealand. What's the sort of secret sauce or mark of differentiation? Because, is it maybe IP on the product side? Is it more quality of service or reputation? Or what's the differentiating factor for Cohort, the group today?
It's been a deliberate decision to trade under the names of the companies of the individual subsidiaries. So they all trade in their own names. Cohort doesn't sign any contracts. That's occasionally discussed, but until now, I think it's been the right call, because many of the businesses that we bought existed long before Cohort did. And there's a lot of pride in the subsidiaries in the name, and it fits with the sort of devolved management model that we have. But at the same time, we do pull the companies together for various purposes when needed. We do quite a lot of exhibition work together. Andy has a couple of sort of overseas missions a year where he takes 2 or 3 of the MDs with him, and they go and see customers, for example, in Asia at a senior level or in Australia. So we do brigade them together for those sorts of purposes. Sometimes they work together. Chess and SEA have a valuable cooperation because Chess make the positioning systems and SEA make the launcher systems for naval countermeasures. And that's a very active area. And they have worked up a new design together, which is, I would say, extremely promising in the market, both domestic and export. So they do work together. So that's sort of by way of how we perceived, generally the subsidiaries are trading on their own, but Cohort also is known in the background. It's a name that's known, particularly in the MOD, but with some of the overseas customers. And what Cohort puts behind them is obviously quite a lot of experience, judgment about bids. I mean, this is a very crucial area of our activity, and it is across the defence space, really. We are very often taking on a contract which involves development. I mean, in various degrees. Sometimes it might not be very much. Sometimes it might be a great deal, as under the current sonar contract for Italy from our German subsidiary. Getting that judgment of technical risk versus the commercial conditions and the price, and if relevant, how much you're willing to invest in the project yourself at the beginning is a very key part of our business. So getting the bid right is crucial. I mean, if you get a major bid wrong, it's very difficult to correct it. You end up chasing your tail, sometimes for several years. That is the crucial area. I don't say we always get it right or that we will always get it right, but key bids are approved at the Cohort board level, and we have a lot of experience there. I mean, it's worth just perhaps going down this avenue because it's something we do slightly differently. All the directors of Cohort, including all the non-executive directors, have extensive defence experience. So, the current chairman of the audit committee, Jeff Perrin, was trained at GEC, ran defence businesses for GEC, and is a deeply experienced guy, both finance and general management. The most recent person to join the board is Peter Linus, who was the finance director at British Aerospace till 2021, BAE Systems. Very senior and respected man in the industry, obviously with a great deal of experience of just these sorts of things that I'm talking about. Beatrice Nicholas was director of engineering at Leonardo, so she brings a great deal of technical strength to the board. And Ed Lowe was the head of Thales' worldwide naval business. So these are people with a lot of very senior experience. They're not shadow executives, but they are a very useful source of check and balance and advice to the executives in the business. I think that's been an important part of our success. I mean, whatever it was that Tiny Rowland called his NEDs, 30 years ago, wallflowers, I think it was. We are quite the opposite in Cohort. They are very good and experienced people who the whole company makes a great deal of use of, and we work them hard. If there is a secret, I think some sort of source that you mentioned, it's a combination of agility. I think we react quickly to our customers just because our business units are on the whole smaller and less bureaucratic than ones that they're competing with. We have real technical innovation in areas that makes a difference to the customer. And we combine that, I think, with a sort of value for money offering. I mean, the overheads are far higher than I would like at Cohort, mostly driven by regulatory function, which we can come back to. Again, relative to bigger companies, our overheads are smaller. And I think we have a pretty cost-effective offering. So I think it's a combination of those things: agility, technical innovation, and value for money.
So perhaps we just come on and talk a bit about the way the world has changed in the last few years and how that has impacted Cohort and how you see it unfolding. How do you see things evolving over the foreseeable future, I don't know, the coming decade?
I mean, I'd rather not go into too many details on this point, but there has been specific activity in relation to the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine is not a customer of Cohort, but the MOD has been a customer of Cohort in respect of certain things which the MOD have done as part of their support to Ukraine. So I'd rather not go into any details, but Ukraine has had an influence on our business the last couple of years. Again, not huge, but some impact. I mean, obviously, compared with other parts of the industry, I mean, obviously, if you're in the 155 ammunition game in Europe now, the spigots are turned on, and Rheinmetall are a huge beneficiary of that, for example. So not on that scale, but that has been an influence for us. More generally, I would say that if we look to Asia, the Chinese Navy has expanded colossally over the last 20 years and continues to expand. It is a source of very considerable concern. I mean, I'm not an expert on Asian geopolitics, but I just see some of the results which emerge from it. I mean, it is quite plainly a source of concern to other countries in the region. I mean, Australia, notably. I mean, it's worth saying a word about that. I mean, the AUKUS program is the single biggest call, I would say, that I've seen in my lifetime in this industry. I mean, it's a huge, huge call. I mean, for Australia to take the option of becoming a nuclear submarine operator is a colossal undertaking, financially, industrially, and it's a commitment for decades. I mean, the lifespan of a nuclear submarine from sort of starting design to decommissioning is probably 60 years. So this is a huge undertaking. And also what it says politically, I think, is huge. I mean, the Australians are saying, we've got to do something about this. I'm not a politician, but I mean, the Australians feel that they need to have a greater ability themselves to project force in the oceans around Australia, which are, of course, vast. And they eventually concluded that diesel submarines simply couldn't cut it for them. A diesel submarine and a nuke submarine are ultimately chalk and cheese. I mean, a nuclear submarine is capable of operating for months on end underwater. It carries its own power station with it. And the Australians decided that's what they needed. Also, they decided that the partners for this had to be the United States and the UK. So it was all very interesting, a huge undertaking and a big sort of political call and political change in Australia. And we'll be involved in aspects of that, I'm sure. I mean, it's a long way to go, but things like submarine communication systems and so on are part of our offering down at SEA. I think that will come into play. And then more generally in the ASEAN countries around the South China Sea, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, they all feel this expansion of Chinese naval power, and they themselves want to increase their naval assets. And so those are all strong markets for us. Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines are all buying equipment from us in various forms, ELAC on sonar side, SEA on torpedo launchers and other equipment. So that's a big change geopolitically. And then, of course, just coming back to Europe, the extension of the Ukraine problem is a perception in Europe that the peace dividend is over. And I'm not a political figure, but I mean, I think the sense in Europe is that they misjudged Russia now over quite a long period, over, at least 10 years and maybe as much as 20 years. Europe allowed itself to become too dependent on Russian oil and gas. And the way the situation has evolved is dangerous to European security. I mean, the change in Germany is really quite an extraordinary thing to behold in a very short space of time. I mean, it's interesting. You talk to the senior Germans, I mean, industrially, politically, they simply never thought this could happen. Their view of it was that the sort of mercantilist links between Germany and Russia were so strong that it would prevent the sort of emergence of hostility beyond a certain point towards Europe from Russia. I mean, that's not been the case. I'm not a Russian expert, but it's to some extent a reversion to type. If you run a top-down political system substantially for the benefit of the people who are running the system, the financial benefit of the people who are running the system, in the long run, to keep that going, the only way you keep your population behind you is to have external enemies. So Russia now needs external enemies for the regime to survive. And I think that's a worrying thing for all of us. So that is finding its way into increases in defense expenditure in Europe. I mean, it's very noticeable in some places. Poland's not at the moment a major customer of ours, but they might become so. Norway is a major customer of ours. Sweden, we have some very promising business, and elsewhere in Europe. So a big change in Europe too. So the market has strengthened. I think will continue to do so for a period of time. We are in some of the areas which are, I mean, I mentioned, of course, we're not in the ammunition business, but we are in the naval game. In anti-submarine warfare is a major part of what we do, and that's a growth area. We are in the business of defense against hypersonic missiles through launcher systems, countermeasures. Defense against hypersonics is a growth area. I could find a number of others, but they're two very sort of clear ones where we are in the right places to benefit from the way that expenditure is increasing.
So one of the things you've touched on a couple of times is the cost of being a PLC. Can you just talk about how being a PLC has changed over the time since you've established Cohort? And perhaps you could touch on the way that investors have come to understand, if that's the right word, the defence industry and the way the business operates?
One way of illustrating the answer to your question is, I think the first annual report I ever signed, that took responsibility for at Alvis, which was sort of 24, 25 years ago, was around 40 pages long. I think the last cohort report for a company which in real terms is still quite a bit smaller than Alvis was, I think our report was 140 pages. I can assure you the company is not 3 or 4 times better managed and doing a better job for shareholders and employees and everyone else than Alvis was. I mean, this is a huge growth in regulation and compliance, which is driving a lot of cost. And it's quite a big burden for smaller companies. I don't think this is the right forum to talk about the merits of all of this. But I mean, I think just suffice to say that, in my opinion, there is no strong body of evidence to say that there's one management model that is superior in terms of the results it produces, whether for staff or for shareholders or anyone. Take the example of the United States, where they have a chairman-CEO concept. You know, the chairman is the CEO in major American companies for the vast majority of them, and is a powerful figure who exercises a great deal of influence over the board. The split role in the UK and over much of Europe is a different approach. I mean, can anyone objectively argue that American companies run by chairman CEOs are producing worse results than the? I mean, the evidence is not there. Our approach is to obviously obey the law, follow the regulatory requirements, not all of which are law, but not to allow them to cloud the essentials of running a good business, which sometimes they can be in danger of doing. Again, this is a big subject, but we live in a world where I would say conscience and common sense have to some extent been replaced by regulation and compliance. And the danger in that is that regulation and compliance drive out conscience and common sense, because everyone thinks, when you see it in accounting standards and all sorts of things, everyone thinks when they've ticked the compliance box, they've done the job, instead of thinking for themselves from first principles about what is the right thing to do. Anyway, that's a sort of almost philosophical point, but I think it's a problem for business. So the regulatory burden has increased a lot on all fronts, and that is a burden for a smaller listed company like Alvis. In defence specifically, obviously the sector, the number of quoted companies has shrunk a lot in the UK. It's now pretty small. I mean, it was never a huge sector, but it's now really quite a small sector. So I think the number of city specialists who follow defence would be very, very few now, because there isn't the universe of companies to justify it. But there are still, I think, enough of experienced people who are perhaps more industrials and that sort of thing, of which defence is, they're not absolute defence specialists. But I don't feel that we have faced difficulty in getting our story across. I think there are sort of different issues affecting AIM and appetite for stocks and appetite for Cohort in particular, but I don't think getting our story across is particularly a problem. I watched with a sort of initially just a bit of surprise and then with a mild consternation, as from about 4 years ago, or even 5 years ago, it started to creep into the ESG concept that defence was something dirty, like tobacco. So defence was a dirty business, and as part of ESG, you shouldn't have anything to do with defence. I mean, it was limited, but it was starting to come in a bit. And I couldn't understand it because, it is fundamentally wrong. If you take a step back from it, we have never elected a government in this country on a pacifist manifesto. Pacifism is a respectable philosophical position, but it is not one that is shared by well over 90%, probably well over 95% of the British electorate. Governments of all persuasions have considered national defence proper use and necessary use of the country's resources. So the idea that suddenly defence is a dirty business, which is an odd thing, I don't think it's a view widely held in the population. And the government didn't seem to do much about it. I went actually I saw him as a conference, the then defence minister, about late 21 it probably was, and said, this is getting out of hand. It could affect the cost of capital. Do you really want companies coming to you with higher prices in the UK because you are doing nothing to push back against this idea, which is wrong, that defence is a dirty business. And the government saying, oh, yeah, well, you're right, we do need to do something about it, even though we're trying to do this, trying to do that. And then Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine, and the scene has changed dramatically. I've not heard that to any significant degree over the last 2 years. I think it's the case that HSBC are still reluctant to bank defence businesses. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I believe it's the case. So that's an interesting one. The doubts have their own reasons for that. But on the whole, that specific issue of defence being a problem under ESG considerations has gone away.
Could you just give us your view of what you think Cohort will look like, say, in 10 years' time? You've been a consolidator, but it seems like we're in an industry, or this is an industry, where you are either a consolidator or you become consolidated.
I mean, I think for Cohort, we think our model has further to run. We don't consider that there is any reason to think that Cohort would be better as a consolidatee in the short to medium term. But which isn't to say, I mean, we're not a private company. We have a significant broad shareholding, but the majority of the shares are held by outside shareholders. And ultimately, if somebody has a strong enough desire to buy a defence company and wants to buy a company like Cohort and wants to pay enough money for it and is satisfactory as an owner to the British government, which is becoming more of a consideration because of the new National Security Act and so on, then it's not as if the decision is entirely ours at that point. But as far as the board is concerned, we believe that operating independently for the time being is certainly the right thing for Cohort. If the facts were to change at some point, then we might have to change our minds with it. But that's strongly our view. There's not an absolute flood of them, but I think they seem to come along with sufficient regularity to, as it were, be helpful to our model. I think there will be further acquisitions of similar size down the road. A very big change in the industry in my lifetime is that whereas defence used to be a driver of technological change, with quite a lot of major technologies which then were important in commercial life emerging from defence, the internet actually being just one example. The internet was a creation of the Pentagon. The trend now is very much the other way. So although there remain specific things which are pure bits of defence, often to do with the kinetic end of things, what actually is the sharp instrument at the end, explosives and these sorts of things, directed energy weapons, where the research is perhaps in defence, but the vast majority is coming back from the commercial sector. So increasingly, the developments in defence, in obviously computing, communications, all those things that have happened in the C4 I-STAR area over some decades now, the technology is essentially driven from the commercial sector. And that's likely to continue. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk now about AI and various other things of that sort. How will that play into the industrial structure of defence is not so clear. The history is that the specialisation of dealing with these customers to some extent is so great that in the end, the technologies tend to get pulled in behind and with existing contractors rather than giving rise to a whole new crop of companies. But there could be some of that, and I wouldn't like to predict exactly which way it will go. I mean, I can give you a small example of it. One of our businesses, Marlborough Communications Limited, is different from the other 5 companies in that it is mainly a reseller of, I think that's a slightly better word than distributor, because distributor seems more commoditized, but it's a reseller of products and technology that come from overseas, particularly from the States, into certain specific customers in the MOD, special forces, 1 or 2 other areas to do with land communications, land electronic warfare, and so on. And what they do is find innovative products in smaller companies on the whole, partly in Europe, but mainly in the States, where they know that there's an interest in the UK MOD, and Marlborough basically acts as the middleman and brings that company, that product, into the MOD. And obviously with a business model that has some return from doing that. The reason that that works for a lot of particularly these smaller companies is a small company in California that has a new software or communications technology or something that has a potential place in the UK MOD's plans. That company in California doesn't even know where Bristol is, never mind Abbey Wood, or never mind being willing to deal with the apparatus, it is a quite bulky sort of procurement system. I mean, under extreme pressure, the MOD can be agile. I mean, dealing with Ukraine, for example, or Iraq and Afghanistan. But on the whole, they are not, because the business of protecting taxpayers' money involves a bureaucratic process. That's the fundamentals of it. Sometimes it succeeds in protecting taxpayers' money, and probably sometimes it wastes it as a result. But that's what they do. So a smaller foreign company doesn't want to come to the MOD direct. It's just too much trouble. So they will prefer to deal with a company like Marlborough. And for MOD, they know Marlborough, they know they deliver, makes it easier for them. So that's just a smaller example of the way that commercial technology actually gets often channeled through traditional suppliers. So I don't know, is the short answer. I mean, I think in terms of things that we do, I think the demand for them and the way they're likely to be supplied, I don't see any significant change in that in the next 10 years. So I think we can look out that far. I'm taking a risk in saying this, but I see things may get nibbled a bit, but I don't think our meals are particularly likely to be taken, our lunchbox can be taken away instantly by some other technical approach as we see it at the present time.
Nick, that's great. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating. You've really given us some invaluable context, not just to Cohort, but to what is going on in an increasingly important part of the world today and how it might evolve in the coming years. So thank you for your time today. It's been fascinating. And Tom, thank you for your questions as well. It's been very helpful and illuminating.
Well, we've got an interesting period coming ahead. It's certainly worth watching.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.